If you've spent any amount of time in the Bible, then you've heard them referenced, the 12 tribes of Israel. It's ancient and maybe even a little mysterious. People hear it in sermons, see it on maps, run into it in Revelation, and know it matters somehow. But for a lot of readers, the 12 tribes mostly remain a blur. A list of names from the Old Testament: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Or something close to that. Maybe you remember that Joseph gets split into Ephraim and Manasseh sometimes. Maybe you remember Levi gets treated differently. Maybe you know Judah matters because of David and Jesus. But beyond that, it can all feel a little foggy. And that's a problem because the 12 tribes are not just an Old Testament roll call. They are one of the Bible's main ways of telling you what Israel is. Not a family, a people. Not just descendants, a covenant nation. A living structure that runs through the whole storyline of Scripture. That's why the 12 tribes matter. And the best way to understand them is not just to ask, can I memorize all of those names? The better question is, what are the 12 tribes actually doing in the Bible? Because once you see that, the whole thing gets clearer. The story starts with Jacob. That's the first key. Before there were 12 tribes, there was one man whose name was changed. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham and son of Isaac, wrestles with God in Genesis 32, and in that moment, his name is changed to Israel. That matters because the tribes are not just tribes in the abstract, they're the family lines that come out of Israel. They are the sons of Jacob, whose new name becomes the name of the entire nation. So when the Bible talks about the children of Israel, it's speaking both literally and theologically. Literally, these are the descendants of Jacob. Theologically, they are covenant people whose identity is rooted in God's dealings with his family. That's why the tribes begin with sons. Jacob has 12 sons, born through Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Those are the original 12. And at first, they are not a nation. They are a family. And not a particularly healthy family either. That's important because the 12 tribes do not begin as a noble, united, spiritually mature people. They begin in rivalry, jealousy, betrayal, favoritism, and fracture. Joseph is sold by his brothers. Reuben is unstable. Simeon and Levi are violent. Judah has his own moral collapses before his later transformation. The family of Israel begins in all the messiness of actual human history. That matters because the Bible is not romantic about the origin of God's people. It sounds like a soap opera. It does not present the tribes as 12 polished heroes founding a holy civilization. It presents them as 12 branches of one deeply complicated family, whom God has chosen to carry promise. That is the first big thing to understand. The tribes are not the reward for human greatness. They are the shape God's covenant promise takes in history. That promise, of course, goes back to Abraham. God had promised Abraham descendants, land, and blessing, not just for one family, but ultimately for the nations throughout that family. The tribes are how that promise starts taking visible form. Through Jacob's sons, the seed of Abraham multiplies. By the time you get to Exodus, what began as a family has become a people. That is when the tribes start to matter in a larger way. In Egypt, the descendants of Jacob grow into a multitude. The tribes become the structure for Israel's identity. When God brings Israel out of Egypt, he's not rescuing a vague group of former slaves. He's bringing out a people made up of tribes, clans, and households. Some are part of the actual people group, and some saw what happened and decided to follow Yahweh. That tribal structure is everywhere in the Pentateuch. When the people camp in the wilderness, they camp by tribe. When land is distributed in Canaan, it's distributed by tribe. When leaders are counted, armies assembled, inheritance tracked, priestly duties assigned, and covenant identity maintained, tribe matters. The 12 tribes are the framework of Israel's national life. That's the second key. They're not just genealogical facts, they're covenant architecture. That means the 12 tribes help answer a huge biblical question. How does one family become one people? The answer is through tribes. Now, this is where something important happens. The tribal list starts to get a little complicated because if you read the Bible closely, you will notice that the 12 tribes are not always listed exactly the same way. And that's because the number 12 stays constant, but the distribution shifts depending on the context. That can confuse people, but it actually makes sense once you see why. The two biggest reasons are Levi and Joseph. Levi matters because the tribe of Levi is set apart for priestly service. They do not receive tribal land in the same way the other tribes do, because the Lord is their inheritance. They are distributed among the people in Levitical cities and tied to worship, priesthood, sacrifice, and tabernacle service. That is huge because it means one of the tribes is marked off for sacred service in a unique way. Levi is still a tribe, but its role is different. It helps maintain the religious life of Israel rather than operating exactly like the other territorial tribes. And then there's Joseph. Joseph in his line is often represented through two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, whom Jacob adopts and blesses in Genesis 48. So instead of Joseph being counted as one tribe in certain contexts, Ephraim and Manasseh are counted separately. That is how the number 12 is maintained when Levi is excluded from land allotment lists. So, if you've ever wondered why the tribes are sometimes listed differently, that's the reason. The number 12 remains symbolically and structurally important, but the exact names can shift depending on whether the context is genealogical, territorial, priestly, military, or symbolic. That matters because the number 12 itself carries weight. It becomes the number of covenant completeness for Israel. 12 tribes, 12 stones, 12 loaves of bread of the presence, and later in the New Testament, 12 apostles. That's not accidental. The number 12 becomes a way of speaking about the fullness of the covenant people of God. That's why the tribes matter far beyond the book of Joshua. Now, if you really want to understand the tribes, you also have to understand that they are not all equal in biblical significance. All 12 matter, all are part of Israel, but some tribes play larger roles in the storyline than others do. Judah is the clearest example. Judah does not begin as the obvious hero. In Genesis, he's flawed, compromised, and deeply human. But by the time Jacob blesses his sons in Genesis 49, Judah receives a remarkable word. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. That line becomes enormous in the rest of Scripture because David comes from Judah, the royal line comes from Judah, and ultimately Jesus comes from Judah. That's why Judah becomes the dominant tribe in the southern kingdom and one of the most important tribal identities in the entire Bible. And then there's Levi. Levi's importance is different, not royal, but priestly. From Levi comes Moses, Aaron, and the priestly line, the tabernacle service, the sacrificial system, the guardianship of holy things. All of that is bound up with Levi. So when you think about the life of Israel before God, Levi is at the center of it. And then Joseph, particularly through Ephraim, becomes so prominent that sometimes the prophets can use Ephraim almost as shorthand for the northern kingdom. That's how central Joseph's line becomes in later Israelite history. Benjamin matters too, smaller but important. Saul, Israel's first king, comes from Benjamin, and Jerusalem sits on the borderlands associated with Judah and Benjamin, which also matters later. So the tribes are not flat. Each has its own role, memory, geography, strengths, failures, and symbolic weight. Then comes one of the most important shifts in the story. The tribes do not remain united. This is crucial. Under David and Solomon, the tribes are gathered under one monarchy, but after Solomon's death, the kingdom split. The northern tribes form the kingdom of Israel. The southern tribes, centered on Judah, form the kingdom of Judah. That fracture changes everything. From that point on, the tribes are not just the structure of a people, they become part of the tragedy of a divided people. The northern kingdom, often associated broadly with Israel or Ephraim, eventually falls to Assyria. The southern kingdom, Judah, later falls to Babylon. This is where the idea of the lost tribes begins to emerge in popular imagination, especially concerning the north. Assyria conquers, disperses, assimilates, and destabilizes the northern tribes in ways that make their later history much harder to trace cleanly. That has generated endless speculation through the centuries, and some of that speculation gets strange really quickly. But the biblical point is more important than speculation. The tribes matter because their scattering becomes part of Israel's judgment and part of Israel's longing. The people who were once structured and gathered under covenant are now fractured, exiled, and dispersed. That's why the prophets so often speak of regathering. Because one of the great hopes of the prophetic voices is not just personal salvation or spiritual comfort. It's the restoration of Israel, the regathering of the tribes, the healing of division, the renewal of covenant life, the return of a scattered people under the reign of God. That is one reason the tribes still matter in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and beyond. They are not just old history, they are part of the hope. Then you get to the New Testament and something fascinating happens. The tribal language doesn't disappear. In fact, it gets reconfigured. Jesus chooses 12 apostles. That's not by happenstance. He could have chosen 10 or 7 or 70, but he chooses 12. Why? Because Jesus is not merely gathering individual followers, he's symbolically reconstituting the people of God. The 12 apostles correspond to the 12 tribes. It's a kingdom act, a covenant act, a restoration act. Jesus is signaling that in him, Israel's story is being renewed and fulfilled. That's why when Judas falls away, there is urgency in Act 1 to replace him. The number matters. Matthias is appointed so that the 12 is restored. The apostolic band is not merely administrative, it is symbolic of the renewed people of God. That is huge because it means the tribes do not only belong in the Old Testament, their meaning carries forward in the mission of Jesus. Then, of course, Revelation takes the tribal imagery and turns it into something even more sweeping in Revelation 7. The servants of God are sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel with a list that is itself unusual and symbolic. Then in Revelation 21, the New Jerusalem has 12 gates named after the 12 tribes and 12 foundations named after the apostles. The Bible is deliberately bringing the imagery together: Israel, the apostles, Old Covenant and New Covenant fulfillment. One redeemed people of God gathered under the reign of the Lamb. That means the tribes are not just the beginning of Israel's story, they become part of the final symbolic vision of the people of God made whole. Now, that does not erase all of the difficult questions people ask about the tribes. What happened historically to each line? How literally should we read every later reference? How do tribal promises relate to the church? How do we understand Israel and the nations in light of Jesus? Those are real questions, and Christians have answered them in different ways across traditions. But the big picture is clear. The 12 tribes are the family structure through which God forms Israel, and they are the covenant framework of the nation. They become part of the tragedy of division and exile. They remain part of the prophetic hope for restoration, and they are echoed in the 12 apostles and the final imagery of Revelation as part of the full people of God. That is the broad biblical role of the tribes. Maybe the best way to say it is this: the 12 tribes are not just 12 names on a list, they are the way promise becomes a people. Through them, the covenant with Abraham takes national shape. Through them, Israel receives land, inheritance, identity, and structure. Through them, the drama of unity, fracture, exile, and hope unfolds. And through their symbolic fulfillment, the Bible keeps telling the people of God gathering a people for himself. That is why they matter. And it also helps explain why the Bible does not hide the failures of the tribes, because the tribes are not there to make Israel look impressive. They're there to show that God works through an actual family, an actual people, an actual history full of sin, rivalry, judgment, mercy, and promise. That's the beauty of it. Reuben falls, Simeon and Levi burn with violence, Judah stumbles before he leads, Joseph suffers before he saves, the tribes fracture, the kingdom divides, exile comes, and still the promise keeps moving. That's the deeper story. The 12 tribes do not prove human greatness, they prove divine faithfulness through human weakness. Maybe the best image is to think of the 12 tribes as beams of the house. At first, they look like separate lines, separate names, separate stories, but together they form the framework God uses to build a people in history. Some beams bear more visible weight, some are hidden, some get damaged, some stand in places of tension and fracture. But without the framework, you cannot understand the house. That is what the tribes are in structure. The framework of Israel's life as a covenant people. So, who are the 12 tribes of Israel? They are the descendants of Jacob's 12 sons. They are the family lines through which Israel becomes a nation. They are the covenant structure of Israel's life in land, worship, inheritance, and identity. They are the tribes that later fracture in history and become part of Israel's exile and longing. And they are one of the Bible's great ways of showing how God takes one family, fills it with promise, and turns it into a people through whom his purposes move toward the world. That is the 12 tribes of Israel explained. Not just a list of names, but the shape of a people, the framework of a covenant story, and one of the main ways that the Bible teaches you how promise becomes history.